She buried her husband in the spring, and returned home, not for answers, but for peace. But peace wasn't waiting for her. A forgotten garden. A sealed box beneath the blue irises. Inside, letters that should have never seen daylight. A forbidden love. A child born in silence. And a truth hidden so well, it nearly died with the last breath of the woman who carried it. Now her granddaughter holds the key. And one question echoes through every page. What if your family wasn't broken by time, but by a choice made in love, and buried in shame? But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Ellen Barlow stepped off the Greyhound bus with a slow, deliberate grace, the kind of movement you learn only after years of carrying grief like it's stitched into your bones. The coastal wind off Springwood Harbor met her like an old friend who'd grown quiet with age, brushing strands of silver hair from her forehead as she adjusted the worn strap of her leather bag and took her first step back into a town that had once held her laughter like it was something sacred. It had been nearly 50 years since she last walked these streets with the freedom of a young girl and the future waiting somewhere just beyond the curve of the shoreline. Now, with her husband John gone 7 months and the house in Phoenix sold, she had nothing left to keep her from answering the pull of the place where she'd been a child before the world began asking her to be anything else. The house sat at the edge of town like it always had, alone but not unloved, though time had taken its payment in peeling paint, bowed steps, and a porch swing that groaned like it had secrets too tired to whisper. It had belonged to Aunt Vivian, or Miss Vivian, as the town used to call her, half out of respect and half because nobody ever knew quite what to make of her. Vivian had vanished from family gatherings sometime in the late 60s, the same year Ellen left for college and never looked back. Ellen found the key exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, tucked in the mouth of a stone frog beside the front steps, its brass surface dulled by decades of salt and silence. She held it in her hand longer than she should have, feeling the chill of it press into her palm like a tiny anchor, reminding her that this wasn't a dream or a detour, it was a reckoning. The door opened with a sound like old paper tearing, and the scent that met her was exactly what she expected. Dust, lavender, mothballs, and the faintest trace of pipe smoke that had no business lingering in a house where no one had lived in over a decade. She stood in the entryway for a long moment, letting the past stretch its legs around her, filling up the spaces in her chest where loneliness had been keeping house. Later that afternoon, after she'd dusted off a chair by the front window and made herself a cup of tea on a stove that still sparked like it had something to prove, Ellen wandered out back to the garden, or what was left of it. The roses were gone, choked out by ivy and creeping bramble, and the vegetable patch had collapsed into an unrecognizable mass of earth and rusted tools. But there, in the far corner, near the willow tree that had always leaned like it was listening, the irises still grew. Blue. Just as she remembered. The kind of blue that doesn't belong to sky or sea but something older and sadder. Kneeling took longer than it used to, but she did it anyway, fingers reaching out to brush the petals like they were the hands of someone long lost. That's when she saw it, the edge of a wooden plank jutting out from beneath the soil, just enough to catch the light. She tried to dismiss it as a piece of broken fence, something tossed aside during a storm or left behind by careless gardeners. But the wood was smooth, treated, deliberate. She pulled at it, dirt tumbling in clumps as her hands dug deeper, revealing more, brass hinges, a curved lid, and a lock as thick as her thumb. The box was old, older than her, maybe older than the house itself. There were initials carved into the side, faded but legible, V.B. Vivian Barlow. Her heart thudded once, heavy and strange, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to remind her that time is not a line but a circle we walk without knowing. Back inside the house, she found a rusted key in a drawer of old buttons, coins, and forgotten trinkets. It slid into the lock with a resistance that made her question everything, and then, with a click soft as a sigh, the chest opened. Inside were letters bound in faded ribbon, several journals with brittle pages and ink smudged by time or tears, and one envelope marked, "To Ellen, only when I'm gone." She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat by the chest for hours, reading page after page of her aunt's looping script, slowly unraveling a life that had run parallel to her own but in an entirely different direction, a life filled with names she didn't recognize, places she'd never been, and emotions too raw to be fiction. There was mention of a man, a doctor. Elias Monroe. Black. Brilliant. Compassionate. Unwelcome in 1950s Springwood for reasons that had nothing to do with his talent and everything to do with his skin. Ellen's breath caught when she read the words. They said loving him was a sin. I believed them for a while. Then I stopped believing anything except him. Outside, the garden was beginning to darken, shadows pooling beneath the irises like memories too heavy to stay buried. The next morning, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Written in her aunt's careful hand were those 8 words. If you're reading this, I did not die. And beneath them, coordinates. Just numbers. Nothing else. She stared at them for a long time before copying them into her notebook. That evening, as the sky turned the color of old bruises and the first stars blinked through, Ellen walked to the edge of the property and watched the lighthouse wink at her from across the bay, as if it knew something she didn't, and was just waiting for her to ask. The next morning arrived wrapped in a kind of hush that felt less like silence and more like the house itself was holding its breath. Ellen stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee grown cold in her hands, staring past the cracked glass at the garden where the chest still sat open, its contents now safely spread across the old dining table like the pieces of a life someone never meant to lose. The coordinates hadn't left her mind since she copied them, the numbers pressing themselves into the back of her eyes each time she closed them, like a riddle whispered by someone standing just behind her shoulder. She tried to sleep, but the kind of sleep that comes easy to young people refuses to visit those who've seen too many seasons end too soon. By mid-morning, she'd made up her mind, she needed help. Not the kind of help you call a stranger for, no, this needed someone with roots in Springwood, someone who remembered names carved into old benches or scratched into library book covers, someone who wouldn't look at her like grief had finally twisted her mind into knots. She needed someone who wouldn't think she was chasing ghosts, even if that's exactly what she was doing. That's when the knock came, not at the front door, where guests arrived with fresh pies and forced smiles, but at the back door, the kitchen door, the one people used when they weren't just visiting but coming home. She didn't jump at the sound. Didn't even flinch. Just turned, quietly, and opened the door like she already knew who it was. There he stood, older, broader, weathered like old barnwood left too long in the sun but still sturdy where it counted. Thomas Reed. The boy who used to leave gum wrappers in her locker and once tried to kiss her behind the bleachers, though he missed and got her ear instead. Now he was a man who smelled faintly of books and cedar, wearing a sweater with patches on the elbows and holding 2 steaming paper cups of coffee like peace offerings from the past. Well, he said, his voice the same but dipped in age and something gentler. Wasn't sure you'd remember me. Town's been buzzing since word got out that Ellen Barlow came home. Ellen smiled without thinking, a slow, reluctant thing that felt almost foreign to her face these days. I remember, she said, taking one of the cups from his hand. Though I didn't expect you'd still be making the rounds. I own the bookstore now, Thomas said, stepping inside without being asked, like this was still the kind of place where invitations were optional. Figured if I ever stopped moving, the dust would catch me. They sat at the kitchen table, the smell of old paper and garden soil between them, and Ellen found herself speaking before she'd decided to, telling him about the chest, the letter, the coordinates, and the name she hadn't said aloud until that moment, Elias Monroe. Thomas didn't flinch. He just nodded, slow and steady, the way someone nods when you've said something they were already halfway to remembering. My father used to talk about him, he said, staring out the window now, voice low. Doctor from Boston. Came up here for a season to care for some old sea captain dying of something no one could name. Folks said he was brilliant. Too brilliant to stay in a place like this. What happened? Ellen asked, her hand still wrapped around the coffee cup she hadn't sipped from once. Thomas took a long breath, the kind you take before digging up something you buried too deep. There was a fire, he said. At the old boarding house near the edge of town. Late '59, I think. No one ever proved anything, but he left the next day. Took the first train out, far as anyone knew. Some said he was run out. Others said he just got tired of trying to fix people who didn't want fixing. Ellen felt the words settle inside her like stones dropped into still water. My aunt loved him, she said finally. It wasn't just a fling. She wrote about him like he was the only truth she ever found. Thomas looked at her then, really looked, the way a man does when he realizes the story in front of him is bigger than he expected. I think you're supposed to find him, he said. Or at least the part of him that didn't burn away. That afternoon, they drove into town together, the wind playing with the edges of Ellen's scarf as she stared out at the places she used to know, the church with its leaning steeple, the diner that still had the same neon sign flickering with the same broken O. The Springwood Library was smaller than she remembered, but the records room smelled the same, old glue, yellowed paper, and the quiet sound of history waiting to be asked the right question. With Thomas thumbing through directories, Ellen focused on a brittle folder marked Springwood Gazette, 1959, her fingers moving carefully over headlines about storms and fishing permits until she found it. Local physician leaves town after tragedy strikes boarding house fire. The article was short. Too short. Just a few lines about smoke inhalation, an unnamed victim, and a mention of Drive E. Monroe departing due to personal and professional considerations. No mention of Vivian. No mention of why. But Ellen knew. She felt it in her chest, the way some women know the weather by the ache in their knees. That night, back at the house, she opened one of the older journals and found a page folded twice and tucked into the back cover. The paper was different, glossier, printed. A flyer. Monroe and Sons, Family Medical Practice, Portland, Maine. There was a phone number. And a name circled in pencil. Isaiah Monroe. Vivian's note beside it was short. Just 6 words. He's his father's eyes. He'll know. Ellen folded the paper with care, set it beside her teacup, and stared out at the moonlit garden where the irises slept beneath the sky. Something had shifted. The past wasn't just whispering anymore, it was knocking, loud and clear. She would answer. But not alone. The next morning began with a long-distance ring that echoed through the old kitchen like a ghost clearing its throat after years of silence, and Ellen hesitated before answering, not out of fear, but out of that deep, familiar hesitation older folks know well, the kind that comes when life is about to shift again and you just want one more quiet minute before it does. The number scrawled on the back of the flyer had connected her, after 3 transfers and a receptionist who asked how she spelled Barlow, to a man with a voice smooth as polished oak, calm but not cold, and cautious in the way people are when they've grown up guarding stories they didn't ask to inherit. Dr. Isaiah Monroe speaking, he said, and for one long heartbeat Ellen couldn't speak at all, not because she was unsure of what to say, but because she heard something in his tone that turned her hands cold against the receiver, familiarity, or maybe an echo of someone else entirely. She introduced herself simply, name, town, relation to Vivian Barlow, and when she mentioned the letters and the journals, there was a pause on the line so complete, she thought they might have been cut off. My father never talked much about Springwood, he said eventually, his voice steadier now but laced with something harder to define, something like sorrow, or maybe reverence. But I remember once, when I was just a boy, I saw him holding a photograph of a garden filled with blue irises. He folded it in half before I could ask who the woman was standing among them. Ellen's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't remember the question she'd meant to ask, because the picture he described, the garden, the flowers, the woman, it had lived in her memory for so long, it was hard to believe someone else had seen it too. I found that garden, she said quietly. It's still here. The irises are still blooming. That afternoon, with a storm rolling in off the Atlantic and the wind pulling at her coat like a child begging for attention, Ellen drove the half-hour stretch from Springwood to Portland with Thomas in the passenger seat, maps and old journal pages tucked between them like guardrails against uncertainty. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't the silence of strangers, it was the kind of quiet that grows between people who trust each other to fill the space only when it truly matters. Dar. Isaiah Monroe met them in a small brick clinic on a tree-lined street near the harbor, his office filled with books, photographs, and a clock that ticked too loudly against the hush of the room. He stood when they entered, tall and lean with salt at his temples, eyes sharp but kind, and when he shook Ellen's hand, she felt something stir that she hadn't felt in years, not attraction, not even affection exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if something very old inside her had just stood up and taken notice. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, gesturing for them to sit, and Thomas gave Ellen a glance that said plainly, "This man is his father's son." Over tea, Isaiah listened as Ellen laid out everything, the journals, the chest, the coordinates, and most importantly, the deep, unresolved grief that had hung over the memory of Vivian like fog across a field. When she finally pulled out the letter and laid it on the table between them, Isaiah touched the paper with a care that was almost reverent. "She loved your father," Ellen said softly. "And I don't think she ever stopped." Isaiah nodded, then reached for a folder on a nearby shelf, pulling out a faded envelope, postmarked 1960, never opened, the name on the front in careful cursive, Vivian Barlow. "I found this after he passed," he said, sliding it across the table. "He never mailed it. Never spoke of her again. But he kept this with him until the day he died." Ellen opened it slowly, the paper crackling like old firewood, and as her eyes moved across the page, she felt her throat tighten, her chest hollowing with every word. "Vivian. I forgive them. I never blamed you. I understand now what it cost you to choose silence. If ever our paths cross again in this life, know that you were my beginning and my mercy. And if not, I hope one day someone will carry us both back to that garden, where love once bloomed wild in spite of the world." Beneath the letter was a photograph. It was them, Vivian and Elias, standing near the willow tree, their faces soft with that quiet kind of joy only found between people who don't need to speak their love out loud to make it real. The storm broke just as they left the clinic, fat drops of rain hammering the windshield as if trying to keep them from driving back into the past. But Ellen's grip on the wheel was steady now, and Thomas, silent beside her, didn't need to ask what came next. Back in Springwood, the house felt different, not just because the wind had found a new way to whistle through the eaves, but because something long dormant inside it had started to stir again, awakened by truth, warmed by memory. The next morning brought a surprise Ellen hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to greet, a cab pulling up the driveway, and from it stepped a girl with a suitcase too big for her size and eyes too sharp for her age. "Grandma," the girl said, voice half a question, half a dare. Ellen blinked, then smiled, slow and stunned, as the realization settled in. "Macy," she said. "I thought your mother said." "She changed her mind," Macy replied, brushing damp hair from her face like it was no big deal. "Said I could spend the summer here. That you might need the company." Ellen laughed, not because it was funny, but because something inside her, something dry and cracked, had just started to bloom again. "Well," she said, opening the screen door wider. "I suppose I do." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the garden shimmered in the golden light of late June, Ellen watched her granddaughter walk the path between the iris beds, curious and unafraid. Thomas brought lemonade, Isaiah sent books, and Ellen, for the first time in a long time, felt the future sitting beside her like a friend who'd waited patiently just outside the door. But as the stars rose and Macy knelt to touch the flowers, something caught her eye near the base of the willow, another small wooden box, its lid half covered in soil, as if the earth itself had decided the story wasn't quite finished. And when she opened it, what she found inside changed everything. The box was smaller than the first, no bigger than a recipe tin, and Macy turned it over in her hands the way a child handles something both mysterious and delicate, sensing instinctively that what lay inside was meant for older hearts but too important to ignore. Ellen stood behind her, silent at first, watching as her granddaughter, who barely knew the shape of grief but understood the weight of silence, opened the lid with the kind of reverence that comes only when a moment feels like it belongs to more than just the person living it. Inside were several neatly folded slips of paper, none dated, none signed, and a small cloth pouch, tied at the neck with what looked like a faded silk ribbon, brittle at the edges and fraying like it had survived more seasons than it should have. Macy passed the papers to Ellen without a word, stepping back as if she knew this part of the journey wasn't hers to lead but only to witness, and Ellen took them slowly, her fingers trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with recognition. The first note was written in Vivian's unmistakable hand, her letters still crisp even though time had yellowed the paper and left faint watermarks near the creases. It was not a confession. It was something deeper, a reckoning, maybe, or the kind of admission that only finds its way to paper when a person has spent too many nights alone in the company of regrets. I didn't run, it began. They told me to leave, to disappear, to forget. But I didn't. I buried what mattered. I buried it because I was afraid that if the world saw how deeply I loved him, it would punish him more than it already had. Ellen read the words aloud, slowly, her voice rough around the edges, not from disuse but from the strain of holding back too many memories at once. Macy listened without interrupting, her knees pulled up beneath her on the porch swing, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and blooming earth between them like a bridge built from years that had finally found their voice. The second note was shorter, a list, really. Names. Locations. Dates. Ellen recognized none of them at first, until she reached the final line, Miss Lillian's Home for Wayward Girls, Camden, 1961. That name, though she hadn't heard it in decades, stirred something ancient in her bones, a flicker of an overheard whisper or a story once passed in hurried tones among grown-ups who thought children weren't listening. Lillian's, Thomas said quietly from the doorway, his shadow cast long across the threshold as the sun began to fall behind the trees. My mother used to speak of it when I was a boy. Said it was where families sent their daughters when the truth got too heavy to carry in public. Ellen nodded slowly, understanding landing with the force of something long anticipated but still impossible to fully prepare for. The pouch, when opened, revealed not jewelry or trinkets, but ashes, not enough for a full urn, but clearly human, fine and pale with tiny fragments that shimmered slightly in the fading light. Tucked beside the pouch was a final slip of paper, no more than a torn scrap, with only 5 words scrawled in uneven ink. Scatter me with his memory. The silence that followed stretched deep and wide, the kind that fills rooms like water and makes even the air feel sacred. Macy, young but not naive, reached out and took Ellen's hand, her grip firm, steady, a girl meeting history with open eyes. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the windows closed against the cool whisper of the coastal wind, Ellen sat alone at the dining room table, the journal stacked around her like sentries, and reread the notes until the ink blurred and her eyes ached with the pressure of uncried tears. She didn't know what haunted her more, the love her aunt had been forced to hide, or the legacy of silence that had wrapped itself around generations like ivy around old wood, beautiful from a distance but strangling if left unchecked. Macy returned from her bath in flannel pajamas and damp hair, her face still flushed from warm water and quiet thought. You think she had a baby? She asked, not accusing, just curious, the way the young often are when they're learning how fragile adults can be. I think, Ellen said, pausing to collect her breath and the words that had waited too long, that she might have given away the only piece of him she had left. That night, sleep came in fragments, uneasy and filled with broken images of fires, trains, blue flowers, and crying babies wrapped in wool blankets. Ellen woke just after 3, the moon high and bright outside her window, and slipped quietly down the stairs, not surprised to find Thomas waiting on the porch with a thermos of black coffee and 2 enamel cups. They didn't speak for a while, listening instead to the soft rustle of leaves and the far-off call of an owl echoing through the trees. When they finally did speak, it wasn't about Vivian or Elias or even the ashes they now kept in a velvet pouch wrapped in cotton inside the living room chest. It was about what came next. I think the coordinates lead to where they met, Ellen said finally. Or maybe where they were going to meet if things had turned out different. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon beyond the garden, as if trying to see something not meant for ordinary sight. "Then that's where we go," he said. "To finish what they couldn't." 2 days later, they set out with maps, the pouch, and Macy, who insisted she was part of this now, and in truth, she was. Not just because she had found the second box, but because some burdens are lighter when a child carries a corner of them, even if they don't yet understand the full weight. The path the coordinates traced led them north along the coast, through forgotten roads and small towns where no one asked questions, until they reached a bluff overlooking a wide, endless stretch of gray-blue sea. There were no signs, no markers, no plaques, only an old bench set into the earth, half-sunken and weather-beaten, with the initials EM plus VB carved into its wood, the letters shallow but still defiant after all these years. Macy spread the ashes slowly, her hands cupped like a prayer, the breeze lifting the remains into the wind with a grace that made Ellen's throat close and Thomas turn his face toward the trees. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Some silences carry more meaning than any poem. As the last light dipped below the waterline, Ellen felt something shift, not in the air, but within her, like a door long stuck had finally eased open on its hinges. She stood there for a while longer, until Macy pulled gently at her sleeve and pointed to a carved wooden sign half buried in moss near the edge of the bluff. Spring Haven Retreat, established 1960. The name meant nothing at first. But the date rang like a bell in her chest. And the word retreat, that was what the journals had called it, a dream, a plan, a place to build something new. But it was the tiny plaque below that stopped her heart. In memory of Elias and Vivian, who dared to dream. Thomas stepped beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder, as if to say what neither of them could find the words for. But Ellen already knew. The truth, the full truth, wasn't here yet. Not quite. There was still one piece missing. And the next journal held it. The final journal, the one buried beneath the floorboard in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth, locked with a brass clasp. Waiting. The attic hadn't been entered in years, not since the last storm swept shingles from the roof and the floorboards groaned like a tired animal trying to rest, and Ellen climbed the narrow staircase with Thomas behind her, one hand on the railing, the other holding a flashlight that flickered at every other step like it wasn't sure it wanted to know what lay above either. They hadn't gone looking for the final journal on purpose, not that day at least, not after the scattering, not after watching the wind carry ashes into the sea like they belonged there all along. But Macy had found a cracked floorboard near the chimney wall, and when she pulled it loose with a flathead screwdriver and a 12-year-old stubbornness, she found something wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the dark like someone had put it there in a hurry and never had the courage, or time, to come back. The clasp on the journal wasn't locked anymore, rust had eaten through the hinge just enough to allow the cover to fall open under Ellen's fingers, the leather warm from her touch and the dust around it rising like breath from a sleeping thing. She didn't sit down, she didn't have to, because the first page held more truth than the past 4 weeks of discovery, and she read it standing up, every line bringing her closer to something she thought had died before it ever lived. If anyone finds this, the journal began, know that I did what I could with the years I was given, though the cost of silence has followed me like a shadow I cannot shake. I write now not as Vivian Barlow, niece of Margaret, keeper of the garden, or even as the woman who once loved Elias Munro more than the air in her lungs. I write as a mother. Ellen swayed slightly, one hand gripping the nearest beam, her knuckles white, her breath held in place by the gravity of that single word, mother, and everything it now implied. She read on, each word unraveling the final layer of the mystery they had spent the summer chasing, a thread that had begun with a locked box under a bed of blue irises and now ended in the dusty bones of an old attic. In 1960, after the fire, after the letters were burned and the town turned its back on us both, I left Springwood under the pretense of retreat. But I was not alone. I carried within me the last piece of Elias, our child, the boy the world would never allow us to raise together. I gave birth to him at Miss Lillian's in Camden, under a name not my own, and signed away the right to hold him with arms that ached for months after. I was told he'd go to a good family, a safe family, one that would never tell him where he came from or why he had his father's eyes. Ellen looked up at Thomas, his jaw set, his eyes cast low as though already anticipating what would come next, though neither of them dared say it aloud. The pages that followed detailed Vivian's quiet return to Springwood, her inheritance of the house after her own mother's passing, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of the garden as both tribute and tomb. The irises, always blue, never replanted, never replaced, were grown from the same bulbs Elias had once sent her by post, labeled iris versicolor, wild, stubborn, and lovely. It had been their secret language, a flower for every letter exchanged, a garden rooted not in soil but in memory. But it was the final entry, the last thing she ever wrote, that held the weight of revelation. They told me he was lost in the system, that no records remained. But I never stopped looking. Not truly. Then, in the fall of 1988, I came across a photograph in the Portland Register, a young black doctor standing beside a man twice his age, beaming, holding the keys to a new family practice. I knew the smile. I knew the hands. I knew the heart behind the eyes. I didn't need a birth certificate to know I was looking at my son. His name was Isaiah Monroe. I never told him. I never dared. But I watched, from the edge of his life, for the next 20 years, just to know he was all right. That he became the man his father would have been proud to meet. Thomas reached for Ellen's hand, but she didn't notice at first, too lost in the sea of possibilities now swirling through her memory, through the empty spaces left behind in Vivian's stories, the hesitations in Isaiah's voice during their first meeting, the unspoken familiarity in the way he had stood beside the garden like someone returning home to a place they'd never been. The final line was written in different ink, heavier, shakier, added later, perhaps days before she died. Ellen, if you've come this far, you must tell him. You must finish what I could not. The attic was silent for a long time after that, the only sound the soft creak of boards beneath their feet as they descended together, neither rushing nor speaking, both bound now by a truth too old to bury and too sacred to keep hidden any longer. The next day, Ellen called him, not from the house, not from the garden, but from the bluff where the sea met sky in one endless blue horizon. Her voice didn't shake. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because age teaches you the value of trembling only when it serves a purpose. I have something for you, she said. And I believe it's something that belongs to you. Isaiah arrived at the house alone, no coat despite the breeze, his hands tucked into his pockets like a man who's either bracing for impact or holding something too important to drop. He stepped into the kitchen with that quiet presence of his and waited, not asking questions, just trusting the moment to reveal what needed saying. Ellen handed him the journal, opened to the first page, then stepped back without a word. He read for a long time, longer than she expected, his shoulders rising once, then falling, and finally going still as he reached the last line. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but not with confusion or anger. There was something gentler in the expression, a kind of peace that comes not from answers but from finally knowing the shape of the question. She watched from a distance, he said, almost to himself. And all this time, I thought I never knew her. Ellen placed her hand gently on his. You knew her, she said. More than most people ever know their mothers. The days that followed were slow, beautiful in their quiet, each moment unfolding with a kind of grace that only comes after deep sorrow has made room for something new. Isaiah began spending more time in Springwood, sometimes arriving with books for Macy, sometimes staying late enough that Thomas would joke about setting another place at the dinner table before walking home under the stars. Together, they repaired the porch swing. Replanted the vegetable garden. Built a bench beside the irises. And in early September, just before the leaves began to turn, the town gathered under lantern light in Vivian's garden, not for a funeral, not for a memorial, but for something older and more enduring than grief. A celebration. Of lives connected. Of silence broken. Of flowers that bloom, even after decades of being forgotten. And when the wind passed through the irises that night, it carried not sorrow, but laughter, low, warm, and familiar, as though the garden itself was finally at peace. Write in the comments where you're from, Let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.